So what I'm going to, as Dr. Vinay said, that we have a very heterogeneous audience and these sessions are meant for everybody. So what I'm going to discuss today is what are the various approaches which scientists have used to make vaccines against COVID-19. And as you know, last year, our lives have changed because of SARS-CoV-2. And what we are looking forward in 2021 is to come back to normalcy as early as possible. And for that, probably the only thing is preventive vaccine. Before we go to the vaccine, we all need to know how an immune response is generated to this virus, because the vaccines utilize our own immune system to generate immune response. So SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus, and on its surface, it has its major immunogenic protein, which is the spike protein. Once the virus enters our body, it gets into the antigen-presenting cells, where it is broken down into pieces, and the antigen is presented in context with our MHC to the T cell. Once our helper T cells, what we call as CD4 T cells, see this antigen, they get activated and they provide help to B cells. The B cells are the ones which differentiate into plasma cell and produce antibodies. We are all aware that antibodies are protective to some extent, and the major mechanism by which antibodies cause protection is by neutralizing the virus or causing killing of the virus. In addition, the helper T cells also provide help to the CD8 cells. This is especially important in viral infections, where these cytotoxic T cells cause killing of the virus infected cells. And as we have for other vaccines, we also want memory, that our body should know that we have been immunized against this virus, and if any one of us encounter the virus, we should have protection. And that is what we call as immunological memory, which should be for both B and T cells. So if you see here, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, initially it is, as is true for every viral infections or any infection, initially you get innate immune response, and then we get an adaptive immune response. And as I showed you, that you have T helper cells, you have cytotoxic T cells, and you have a special type of T cells which provide help to B cells, and we generate a memory cells. So this is showing you a speculative dynamics which have also been proven to certain time point, that you have an antigen, the virus, which is shown in purple, and you generate specific T cells. And we hope that these T cells persist for years. And that has been shown for many other viral infections. Similarly, you develop antibodies, the antibodies wane off over time. And people have shown that in COVID-19 infection, there is waning of antibodies after 6 months. But we still have the memory B cells which persist for years. Vaccine development is a multi-step process, and it's not easy to develop vaccines. In the past, it used to take 10 to 20 years to get an effective vaccine. And the three most important steps are the preclinical testing of vaccines, where the scientists try to find out the best antigen possible, which will elicit a very robust immune response. And to further augment the response, we also use adjuvants, which activate the immune system and cause more activation and better immune response. So once we get the best antigen source and the best adjuvant, then they are tried in animal models. You generally start with small animal models like mouse, followed by ferret, which is a model for SARS-CoV-2, and then non-human primates. Once the vaccine has been proven efficacious in animals, it's tested in humans. The phase 1 trials are predominantly to look at toxicity. And then you have phase 2 trials where about 100 to 1,000 people are vaccinated and immunogenicity is seen. And the proof of the pudding is in showing the efficacy, which is done in the phase 3 trials. And as all of you are aware, that phase 3 trials in SARS-CoV-2 infection-related vaccines have been done in 25,000 to 50,000 individuals. Once the vaccine proves efficacious, then only it comes to the market and it is used for mass vaccination. The vigilance doesn't stop there. You still need to monitor people for rare side effects. So that is why it used to take decades to get a good vaccine. But in this era, with better knowledge of science and information from previous platforms which have been used for vaccine, we have been able to compress this period in a matter of less than a year. So this was an editorial in NEJM in May 21, when it was thought that can we develop COVID-19 vaccine at the pandemic speed? The way the pandemic was spreading, would we be able to get vaccine at that speed? And then you have this project, Lightspeed. And you have seen that in January 12th, 2020 was the day when the SARS-CoV-2 genome was sequenced. And in November 18, 2020, we had a vaccine which had 95% efficacy. I mean, this would have been unimaginable before 2020. And all this has happened because of support, both from government, non-government organization, collaboration between countries, and partnership between researchers and the industry. Coming on to the vaccine landscape, it just means that what are the various platforms or antigens which we can use for making vaccines. The nucleic acids, which carry all the message for all the proteins which the virus have. You can use DNA, you can use RNA. These are very easy to make because nowadays to synthesize nucleotides, sequence of nucleotides is very easy, but it has never been done before. Then you can have the live attenuated vaccines, which are the actual virus which have been made weakened so that it generates an immune response, but it does not cause the disease. Or you can make the virus inactivated by using some chemicals or other methods to kill the virus, but it still retains its property of having the antigens on its surface, but it cannot replicate. So inactivated viruses are very safe because they are already dead. Or you can use a small part of the protein, the subunit vaccines, like you're all aware of hepatitis B vaccine, which is a subunit protein vaccine. So these are very, very safe vaccine, but because you're using a small amount of protein, it may be that you don't generate a great immune response. And finally, you can fool the immune system by having an outer coat of a virus which is harmless. You can use measles, you can use rabies, and inside you can put the genetic material of SARS-CoV-2, that is viral vector-based vaccines. So among these, most of these vaccines cannot be used as single-dose vaccines, while the replicating viral vectors or live attenuated vaccines probably can be used as single-dose vaccine. The DNA and RNA-based vaccines have never been used before, and so has been the non-replicating viral vectors. And what we see today is the vaccines which are being used are the RNA-based vaccine and the non-replicating viral-based vector-based vaccine, which we are all getting, that is Covishield. So these viral vector-based vaccines can be produced at a very high scale of production they can have. And similarly for the nucleic acid-based vaccines can be made at a very fast speed. So people have used all these advantages to make vaccines for COVID-19. This is the WHO website, which tells us how many vaccines are in the pipeline. So you have, this is this week's data, that 173 vaccines are in preclinical development and 64 vaccines have moved to clinical development. That means they are in clinical trials. Of these, the majority are protein subunit vaccine. As I told you, they are most safe. And then you have non-replicating viral vectors, and then nucleic acid-based vaccines like DNA and RNA-based vaccines. We all want to have vaccine which is a single-dose vaccine because you know the logistics of giving multiple doses in a large country and to vaccinate the whole world population is not easy. But there are only 20% of vaccines which are being tried as single dose vaccine. Most of the vaccines which are in the pipeline are 2-dose vaccines. And in some, we still don't know that would you need 1 dose or 2 doses. So among these vaccines, there are 19 vaccines which are in phase 1 trial, there are 24 vaccines which are in phase 2 trial, and there are 22 vaccines which are in phase 3 trial. And 10 vaccines have been given authorization for emergency use, and which have been rolled out in many, many countries, and including our own country. So what we said about the immune response, have these vaccines been able to generate of immune response? This is the data of the mRNA vaccine done in non-human primates, which shows that you get good antibody titers with a higher dose. You also get inhibition of binding to the ACE2 receptor. You also get the virus neutralization by this vaccine, the antibodies which develop following the vaccine. You get memory CD4 cells. And finally, you also get that it does not infect the lung tissue. The virus is not able to infect. What I said that we also want a T cell response besides the antibodies. And in this is adenovirus-based vaccine. You can see that as the dose increases, low dose, mid dose, and high dose, there is good number of IFN gamma expressing T cells being generated, both at day 14 and day 28. And there's only a minor difference between low dose and mid dose. And the other thing which says how robust is the T cell response is how polyfunctional those T cells are. That is, how many different cytokines do these T cells produce? And if you see here that most of the CD8 cells and CD4 T cells which have been generated are predominantly polyfunctional, that they produce more than one cytokine. So that shows that we are generating a robust immune response by using these vaccines. And Dr. Gagandeep will cover the clinical efficacy, but this is the RNA vaccine that has shown a great clinical efficacy in preventing infection. And this is our endpoints for vaccines. That one, we want to prevent infection. If we can't do that, can we prevent disease? If we can't prevent infection, can we prevent hospitalization? Can we prevent patients getting admitted to ICU? Or can we reduce mortality? And finally, for the society, can we prevent transmission of disease? We still don't have answers to all of them. The other issues which are there with vaccine are that we are unclear. How long is the duration of protection? Would it prevent an asymptomatic infection? Would it prevent transmission? And finally, that would it cause vaccine-associated enhanced respiratory disease? This happens because when you develop, we want to develop only neutralizing antibodies, which will neutralize the virus. But if you also develop non-neutralizing antibodies, they can activate the macrophages and cause production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can cause tissue damage. Or these non-neutralizing antibodies can also cause a increased uptake of the virus and increase in viral load sometimes. So what we have done so far, that we had a long way to go and we have reached quite far. And I think as a scientific community, we need to be proud of that. Till we get the final answer, this is our best vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you, Amita, for making it so simple for us to understand. Now, I would request Dr. Gagandeep Kang. She is one of the most eminent virologists in the country, who is currently in the Department of GI Sciences at CMC Vellore, and earlier she was the director of the Translational Institute of the Department of Biotechnology. And of course, all of us now know that she is one of the few members of the Royal Society. Dr. Gagandeep, once again, thank you very much for joining us in this academic activity. Please start your presentation. She's going to talk to us about the early birds in the vaccines, which are already in use and in phase 3 trials. Dr. Gagandeep, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody at SGPGI for having me here. I'm really going to touch on very up to the minute news. There were some vaccines that made a lot of progress over the last couple of days. So what I'm going to talk to you about really builds on what Amita has just told us about where we are with the vaccines and the kinds of vaccines we have. So we heard about the mRNA vaccines, and there are two mRNA vaccines that are currently in wide use. The data from both of these vaccines became available in November of 2020. And one of the reasons that it became available so quickly was because they were funded very heavily by, in Moderna's case, by Operation Warp Speed. And Pfizer had made a decision to go ahead with going into phase 3 studies very early on. So these usually, why does it take a long time to develop a vaccine? It takes a long time to develop a vaccine because of the process that Amita told you about, but also because the risk of failure is high. And whenever you are in human clinical trials, that is a very expensive high risk of failure. So what usually happens is once you get into humans, you'll do a phase 1 study, you look for safety, it will be in a small number of participants. You'll get that data, you'll present it to the regulator, you'll write a protocol for the phase 2, the regulator will approve it. So there are lots of gaps between phases. What's happened in this situation is that not only have there been no gaps, there's also been some overlap or combination of phases. Either phase 1 and 2 have been combined or phase 2 and 3 have been combined. In the case of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, BioNTech is a small company that was focused on cancer immunotherapy, working with mRNA, and they decided to make a switch to infectious disease vaccines about 5 years ago. And they had started to work on a MERS coronavirus vaccine, as well as on using the mRNA platform to make multiple vaccine candidates with funding from the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. So when the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was released a little over a year ago, BioNTech was asked whether it would make new vaccines, and they agreed to switch their program to SARS-CoV-2. And about 6 weeks later, were in talks with Pfizer, and that led to the Pfizer-BioNTech partnership that has resulted in the first licensed product, which is an mRNA vaccine. It has shown approximately 95% efficacy. This includes efficacy in older individuals. The problem with this vaccine is that it needs storage, long-term storage at -70 degrees, which makes this vaccine a challenge to deliver at scale, particularly in low and middle income countries. On the exploded map there, you can see which countries the Pfizer vaccine is licensed in. In green is countries where it has full licensure. In yellow is countries where it has emergency use authorization. It's also been given an emergency use listing by the WHO. So this is the vaccine with which we have the most experience, which is all of about 6 weeks since the rollout started. But millions of doses of this vaccine have been given. The Moderna vaccine, developed by a US company, is similar. It has 95% efficacy. Its storage requirements are less stringent, still requires -20 degrees. And this has also been approved by multiple regulatory agencies and given an emergency use listing by the WHO. Now, with Pfizer BioNTech, if we look at the FDA's analysis, you can see here the data for 7 days after dose 2. So 5 weeks after you start the immunization program, you have about 95% efficacy. And as Amita showed in her slides, there's also efficacy, there's a good level of protection that occurs even after the first dose of the vaccine. Now, the other aspect of what we look at in addition to safety, in addition to immunogenicity and efficacy, is safety. And there are always safety concerns with new vaccines or with untested platforms. So in the trials, which included about 45,000 people and for whom about 38,000 people's safety data was evaluated, there were 4 cases of Bell's palsy in the vaccinated and 0 cases in the people who had received the placebo. Now, there were no cases of anaphylaxis that were seen in the trial, but subsequent to the vaccine being rolled out, at least initially, it looked like anaphylaxis was being seen at a rate of about 1 in 90,000 people initially, but it seems now that the rate is something like 1 in 150,000. And this is happening mostly in people who have a history of anaphylaxis before or have a history of very severe allergies. Just allergies to, occasional allergies to food, to medicines, don't seem to be playing a role in predicting this. So this also speaks to the importance of having a really robust safety monitoring mechanism once vaccines are rolled out, because Bell's palsy looked like it might be a signal in the clinical trial. It doesn't so far seem to be one in the rollout. Anaphylaxis was not seen in the clinical trial, but is now being seen when the vaccines are being more widely used. Now for Moderna also, if we look at the protection in all participants, it's about 94%. And if you look here at 65 and older, this is giving about 86% protection. Moderna's results are looking good. Moderna's vaccine is also being rolled out in Northern America and in Europe. Now, with Moderna, the safety signal seems to be somewhat less than is seen with the Pfizer vaccine. There is anaphylaxis that is seen with Moderna, but this seems to be in the order of 1 per 500,000 vaccinated individuals. So about 3 times lower risk than is seen with the Pfizer vaccine. Again, these are early days, and we will need to continue the safety monitoring to understand really how these vaccines perform. Now, if we look at vectored vaccines, how do vectored vaccines work? I think there's one thing that is important to understand is that when you have some kinds of vectors, what you're looking for from the immune response is not only antibody mediated effects, but also T cell effects. So if I can explain that, this is a representation of the Gamaleya vaccine, which is a slightly more complicated vaccine because it has 2 different adenoviruses that are given to people. The adenovirus, shown in blue and pink here with the spikes, carries the sequence for the spike protein of the SARS coronavirus type 2. This is taken up into vacuoles in the host cell. Within the vacuole, the penton spikes of the adenovirus come off, and the adenovirus delivers the message for the SARS-CoV-2 spike to the nucleus of the cell. From the nucleus, the double-stranded DNA is then converted to single-stranded DNA, is read by mRNA, and mRNA leaves the nucleus to deliver the message to the ribosomes about making the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. It makes the cell makes the protein in the cytoplasm, and you need 3 molecules of the spike trimers to combine together to make the spike. On the surface of the cell that has been infected by the vector, you see both the entire spike protein as well as portions of the spike protein being displayed. When this happens, what you get is both an antibody response as well as a cellular response that results in the destruction of the cell that is viewed by the body as being an infected cell. Now, among the adenovirus vector-based vaccines, I'm sorry, my slide seems to have shifted a bit. The ones that are front and center are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, also Covishield, which we are getting. And this is a vaccine that is given as 2 doses 4 weeks apart, and depending on how you look at which arm of the study, it has somewhere between 60 and 90% efficacy. It has received an EUA in the UK, restricted use approval in India, and yesterday was given full approval in the EU. There is a discussion ongoing about why Germany decided that the vaccine was not to be used in over 65-year-olds, but that is because the data from the study are not yet complete, and it's anticipated that when more data become available, there will be information to support that decision, support a revision of that decision. We also got data from the Janssen vaccine, and this is a recombinant adenovirus vector, which is AD26. And this is a vector that has been used previously for an Ebola vaccine, and this shows 66% efficacy. The Gamaleya Institute vaccine has been reported to have 92% efficacy, and this uses 2 different adenoviruses, AD26 and AD5. CanSino uses an AD5 vector, and this is a study for which data are not widely available in the public domain. Their phase 1 data was published in the Lancet and showed that if you had prior exposure to adenovirus, it resulted in a somewhat lower immune response. Now, I'd just like to walk us through some of the Covishield results. Shown in the map is where the serum Covishield AstraZeneca vaccines have been approved so far. And what I'd like us to focus on first is table 2C. This is the AstraZeneca efficacy, and this is for the standard dose and 2 doses of the standard dose. Now here you can see that if the vaccine is given at a dose interval of less than 6 weeks, efficacy is about 50%. And if the dose interval is greater than 12 weeks, efficacy is about 79%. Now, why does this happen? There's a lot of discussion about what is the immune response induced by the first dose and what is the immune response induced by the second dose, and why that dosing interval really matters. But if we look at the recommended schedule in India, that is 4 weeks apart. Now, the other thing that I would like you to look at is the comparison of Covishield and the Oxford vaccine made by AstraZeneca. And these are the data from the Indian participants, where you can see that Covishield is comparable to the results that are produced by the Oxford vaccine. You could argue that Covishield is actually a little bit better in terms of an immune response. However, since we don't have a correlate of protection, we don't actually know whether just the measurement of antibodies, whether they are IgG that is directed against the spike or neutralizing antibody, really correlates with the clinical performance of the vaccines. It's hoped that we will be able to develop an immune correlate of protection, but we don't have one at this time. Now, we got the results from the Janssen phase 3 study, and this was from almost 44,000 participants and over 400 cases. And what it showed was that the vaccine was 66% effective in preventing moderate to severe COVID-19 4 weeks after vaccination. Now, the Janssen study was interesting because the study was done in South Africa as well. And in South Africa, as we know, in the last couple of months, we have had circulation of a variant that is concerning in terms of its ability to escape the immune response. So if you look at effectiveness seen in efficacy seen in this study, it was 72% in the US and 57% in South Africa. The Gamaleya Sputnik vaccine is in phase 2-3 studies in India. They've completed the first 100 and they are recruiting for the next 1500. So the size of the study is similar to what has been done for Covishield. And based on 78 cases, Gamaleya has reported 92% efficacy and said that it is greater than 90% in people over 60 years of age. Gamaleya is also trying out 2 interesting studies. One is called Sputnik Light, which will be a single dose vaccination, and also doing a combination with the AstraZeneca vaccine and add 26 from the Gamaleya vaccine. Now, in terms of inactivated vaccines, we have pretty far along and in wide use 3 vaccines from Sinopharm, from Sinovac, and from Bharat Biotech. The Sinopharm product uses alum as an adjuvant, and this has been reported to have 86% efficacy from UAE and 79% from China. Sinovac has been tested also in multiple locations. This was reported to have 50% efficacy in Brazil, but this is with the inclusion of mild cases. And you usually expect better protection against severe cases. It's about 65% in Indonesia and 90% was reported from Turkey, but this was on the basis of a relatively small study. In India, we have restricted use in the clinical trial mode of Bharat Biotech. This is a vaccine that is based on an inactivation of a strain isolated by the National Institute of Virology. And this has a unique adjuvant that has not been tested in humans before. It's made by a company called Virovax in the US. So this is now being rolled out. They have finished their phase 1 and 2 studies in almost 800 participants. It has really good immunogenicity and it shows a good T-cell response. They've also done animal challenge studies that show good results. They finished recruitment for their phase 3 trial, which is almost 26,000 participants, and follow-up is ongoing. Now, we also got results from the Novavax trial, and Novavax was the first of a new class of a different class of vaccines. This is a protein vaccine, and Novavax makes its vaccines using a baculovirus vector that is then grown in insect cells, and those insect cells produce the protein, the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. That is then purified and adjuvant is added, and that makes the Novavax vaccine. The vaccine has been evaluated in 15,000 people in Britain, and based on 62 cases, of which only 6 occurred in vaccinees, it's been calculated to have 90% protection, 96% against the older coronavirus, and 86% against the new variant, or what's called the UK variant. In South Africa, they had about 4,400 participants, and here the vaccine showed much less efficacy, about 50%, a higher efficacy in those who were not HIV exposed and lower in the ones who were HIV infected. And most of the infections here were from, well, about at least half, if not more, of the infections were because of the South African variant of concern, which is known as B1.351. So there's a lot that we've learned in the last month and a half about vaccines and their performance. There are many other vaccines that are on their way in phase 3 studies. CureVac has an mRNA vaccine. Angus, which is a Japanese company, and Zydus Cadila have DNA vaccines. There's a vaccine called EpiVac Corona, which is a protein vaccine made in China. There's also an Anhui vaccine, and I'm sorry, that's a receptor binding domain and adjuvant vaccine, which is in phase 3. Medicago is making a vaccine in tobacco, and this essentially it gets tobacco plants to produce the vaccine. So ultimately the vaccine will be a protein vaccine. And then Clover, which is also a Chinese company, is making a protein vaccine with adjuvants. So there's a lot that has happened, a lot that is going to happen, and there is a lot for all of us to learn about vaccines and their performance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Gagandeep, for informing us about all the vaccines all over the world, which are there and which are going to come. Our next speaker is Dr. Rakesh Agrawal, who we consider is still part of us, although at the moment he is steering JIPMER Puducherry as its director. He's going to cover the rollout and especially the challenges with the rollout of different vaccines. Rakesh, please take your allocated 20 minutes because Dr. Ish Bhatia has kindly allowed us 15 more minutes after that for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay, and I think that's the home advantage I have. So we've already heard from Amita and Gagandeep about the vaccines. So once we have a vaccine that is approved either for emergency use or for regular use, for use in public health program, there are certain considerations. I've listed 5 of those here, and in the next slide, I have tried to elaborate those. In the vaccine, one needs to look at safety and efficacy, as Gagandeep talked about. This efficacy can be for preventing death, can be for preventing serious disease or disease of any kind, mild, moderate, or severe. There could also be efficacy in preventing transmission by decreasing the excretion of the virus from those who are infected. Logistic issues that one needs to look at is the number of doses, 1, 2, and for some vaccines that could even be 3. And storage and transport, again, that has been talked about earlier. Some vaccines need to be stored at -70°, -20°, making their delivery challenging. The volume needed also becomes important, because that impacts on the cold chain space that one would need for rolling out a particular vaccine. Because this disease affects certain specific age groups more severely, the elderly, and also is more severe in people with certain pre-existing disease conditions, one needs to look at efficacy in specific subgroups, that is, in the elderly and in those with comorbidities associated with severe COVID. Cost, of course, is a consideration, and the amount available has to be looked at in relation to the requirement of a particular country or community. So when we look at vaccine rollout in India for public health purpose, we, with our 1.3 billion population, are looking primarily at reducing the burden of disease, in particular the need for ICU care, and to reduce mortality. Interruption of transmission, that is achieving herd protection, would need coverage of a large proportion of our population. Let's assume that that would be somewhere between 60 to 70% on a conservative scale. Even then, the amount of vaccine needed would be so much that we cannot think of that today. There are countries that are thinking of that approach. Israel, for instance, has already immunized 1/3 of its population, which is on a totally different scale. Same way, UAE has immunized about 1/4 of its population, but we are not looking at that. We are looking at reducing mortality and hospitalization and reducing the social impact of the pandemic and having our economy go ahead. And we do this realizing that there are several knowledge gaps in our understanding of the disease and the vaccine. We do not understand how long the immunity lasts after natural infection, what proportion of our population in different parts of the country has been already infected and is potentially immune. We do not know the efficacy of the vaccine in the specific subgroups, at least for some of the vaccines, and we do not know the duration of protection afforded by the various vaccines. So, as I said earlier, ideally, if the vaccines prevent transmission, again something that we do not know, then everybody should get the vaccine. Even if they prevent severe disease, everybody should get the vaccine. However, production capacity is limited, so we need to prioritize the vaccine for some groups over others. WHO's Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization has developed a values framework about how limited supply of vaccine should be allocated and what groups should be prioritized. And these are based on very well laid out principles that we respect in medicine, and also ethicists respect these. The first is that we want to maximize human well-being, and that means it should be given to those who are at a higher risk of severe disease, coming to harm and death. It is based on principles of equity, global equity, national equity, equity for groups that are downtrodden, equity for the rich and the poor. The next principle is reciprocity, which means people who are contributing more to the global good, to looking after people with COVID, to preventing COVID, should be given preference, and that's where the preference for healthcare workers and other frontline workers comes from. And finally, all decisions should have legitimacy, which means these should be taken transparently. So this is the WHO's prioritization scheme. It is based on, as you see in dark blue, the different stages, which mean how much of population can be covered with the available vaccine. Stage 1, when vaccine is available in very short supply, covering about 1 to 10% of population. Again, that is divided into 2 stages, as you can see, 1A and 1B, depending on whether we are close to 1% or 10%. Stage 2, when vaccine is available to cover up to 20% of population, and stage 3, when even greater large quantities of vaccine are available. So in stage 1, healthcare workers who are at a high to very high risk of acquiring and transmitting infection to their patients are to be immunized. Then come older adults defined by age specific based risk. So these would be the very elderly. And then come the other groups. In India, the various groups that are looking at COVID-19 vaccination strategies. So the COVID-19 working group of the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, as well as NAGVAC, which is the multidisciplinary cross-cutting group beyond Health Ministry that is looking at policies for immunization for COVID, have decided prioritization based on similar principles. The first recipients are people who are at a high risk of exposures. That is the first responders. Again, within that, healthcare providers in health facilities and those providing field level healthcare services are the first ones to be covered. And that started on 16th of January, that is about 2 weeks ago. The next group, which will be receiving the vaccine beginning next week, are going to be other first responders, such as people who are in the police, who are helping implement non-pharmacological interventions such as distancing, masks, etc. And the municipal workers will get at this. And then we will go to those who are at a high risk of poor outcome. That is initially those with age more than 60 and later age group between 51 to 60 and those with younger than 50 who have comorbidities. The number of healthcare workers in the private and public sector with our 1.3 billion population was estimated to be about 1 crore, and that is the first group. And of these, to the best of my knowledge, about 30 lakh have already been vaccinated. The next group, the other frontline workers, are going to be about 2 crores, and the age-based priority groups, those more than 50 years of age and those younger than 50 and having comorbidity, are estimated to be about 26 crores. A total of about 30 crore people are planned over the next 1 year. Prioritization for vaccination is one part. In addition, we need to ensure supplies. There is a lot of logistics involved. So vaccine has to be procured at a reasonable price. It needs to be transported, and in our country with its large geographical area and different topography, we have a lot of transport challenges. That has been done by the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Storage facilities are needed. So those that needed storage at -70 or -20 were not suitable. That's why we have vaccines which are suitable for storage at 4 degrees. Cold chain equipment have been beefed up, and supplies for 0.5 ml auto disable syringes have been procured. Just imagine 30% of our population comes to about 30 crore people needing vaccination. You need 60 crore syringes, and that's a huge challenge to procure them. We have taken decisions and delivery mechanisms have been put into place, and mechanisms to monitor for occurrence of adverse events following immunization and their management have been put into place. However, there are new challenges. Vaccine hesitancy is something that exists around the world. In terms of definition, it is defined as delay in acceptance or outright refusal for taking vaccines in spite of their becoming available and their being available at one's doorstep. Reasons for vaccine hesitancy are multiple, they are complex, they are context specific, and they vary with time, place, and the vaccine. Word over, 3 major factors have been thought as influencing vaccine hesitancy. These are related to convenience. Is the vaccine available close to you? Do you need to pay for it, etc.? Complacency of the potential recipients and the confidence in a particular vaccine. Fortunately for us, in this slide, what you see is the proportion of people who believe that vaccines are safe in different WHO regions. And if we see, That is India. It is surpassed only by Bangladesh. There is a very high 97 to 98% belief among people that vaccines are safe. So we should have had very little vaccine hesitancy. However, vaccine hesitancy, as I said earlier, varies with time and vaccine. When a disease is at its peak and a vaccine comes in, people want to take vaccine coverage increases, and the disease frequency comes down. And that is when people enter a sense of a phase of complacency. Now people start losing confidence. They don't think vaccine is needed because they think disease is going away. Vaccine coverage comes down. It is followed immediately by increase in disease. Again, people start believing in the vaccine. With this resumption of confidence, removal of complacency, then the disease gradually disappears. Also, adverse events do play a role in people losing confidence. And what is happening in India is we are actually somewhere here. So the vaccine has come in when the disease has decreased drastically. So we are starting with a phase where people seem to feel nothing is going to happen. We can relax, read our newspapers, be easy. We don't need to take the vaccine. And that seems to be a major factor, particularly among healthcare workers. And it is somewhat disconcerting because they have seen disease. And surely it is at play because of 1 crore people who were eligible, only 30 lakh have taken vaccine. Also, this may have to do with our failure of communication. The other challenge that we have today is the SARS coronavirus variants that have come in. All viruses, their genome changes over time, in particular for RNA viruses. Fortunately, SARS coronavirus, though an RNA virus, has some proofreading ability, and so the mutation rate is somewhat intermediate. Now, variations are all the time, but they may have no consequences. Sometimes the virus has the similar characteristics, except that it has survival advantage. So the variant strain replaces the original strain. But what we are bothered about is when a new variant has a higher transmission rate, has a different in the propensity to cause severe disease or death, or if the new strain would not be neutralized by the antibodies to the wild type strain or to the vaccine strain. So let's look at SARS coronavirus 2. It has a single stranded linear RNA genome, which is about 30 kilobase long. It codes for 29 proteins. A large part of the genome codes for the various non-structural proteins. There are 4 main structural proteins: the spike protein or S protein that you heard Amita and Gagandeep talk about, envelope protein E, M, and N. When we look at the viral particle, the N protein or nucleocapsid is in association with the RNA in the center, but there are 3 proteins on the surface: the spike glycoprotein or S protein, the E protein, and the M protein. Of these, the S protein is the most important. It exists as protrusions. It's a trimeric protein, 3 molecules joined together to form this, and this is the protein which is used by the virus to bind to the hosts, to the receptors on the host surface, cell surface, and then it is internalized and the viral nucleic acid is carried inside the host cell. So the protection has to come by antibodies directed against this S protein, and that is what we use for the vaccine. So this is when we started last year, somewhere in January 2020. There were 2 different types of isolates that were circulating in China. But by the time the disease reached Europe, we can see very variant types of virus appeared. These 2 shown here in green and yellow were the ones prevalent in different parts of Europe, and the one in blue in somewhat of maroon color is what was seen in the US. The 2 dark and light blue isolates, which were the predominant isolates in China, gradually died down, and it is clear that these green and yellow strains were actually present in very small quantities in China, and it is those that preferentially got transmitted, or those were the ones that were carried early in the outbreak to Europe, and that's where they spread and they became predominant. Some new isolates have appeared over time, as you can see over time. In the upper slide, what you have on the x-axis is the number of mutations. But every time a new isolate came, it varied by 1 or 2 change. However, what suddenly happened in December, a new isolate was detected, which was different from all previous isolates, suddenly by several nucleotide changes. And this is the most varied mutant that has been seen till today. Finally, even though it appeared between November and December, we can see a rapid increase in its prevalence in southeastern UK over a period of 2 months. This is what raised concern. And the other thing was that if we compare it to the wild type coronavirus genome, the genome of this isolate had 23 mutations. 6 of these were silent, but of the remaining 17, 9 were scattered all over, but 8 were in the spike protein, including 2 deletions and 6 substitutions. This meant that the spike protein of this variant in UK, known as B117, could be very different from the original strains. And of these 4 changes that I have highlighted with a box are particularly important. Let's first look at this mutation called N501Y, which means at the 501st amino acid in this protein, asparaginase is replaced by a tyrosine. So when we look at this, as Gagandeep said earlier, this is a trimeric protein. So in each of the 3 molecules, this undergoes a change. So this is the part that interacts with the receptor, and now the binding of the protein with the receptor is relatively feeble. But once you get this change, the interaction becomes stronger, and this variant virus can now bind more strongly to the host cells and is more infectious. Similarly, 2 other changes are located in these projections of the protein, one on this side and one on this side, and it appears that these deletions of 2 amino acid each in the protein make the antibody less likely to bind to the spike protein, and therefore antibodies are less likely to be effective. A 4th mutation is somewhere here, and this again alters the protein to a significant degree. The other way to look at this is that this isolate has spread globally. The areas in black showing where local transmission is also occurring, and those in purple showing areas where imported cases have been seen, the local transmission has not yet been shown to occur, but I think it's only a matter of time before we would have that. We have this isolate in India too. Several cases have been reported. And in each region, so this is 6 curves are for 6 WHO regions for 6 continents, and in each continent where it has appeared, over time, the proportion of cases accounted for by this variant are increasing rapidly. This variant has a higher rate of transmission, is more often associated with severe disease, and in the next slide I'll show you some data that show that it is not as susceptible to antibodies against the usual SARS coronavirus. So this is a paper that has appeared as a preprint, and this takes sera from people who have been immunized with the Pfizer vaccine. This is the data with the wild type virus neutralization, and this is with the variant neutralization, and we can see that, and this is using sera from multiple vaccine recipients. For each of them except one, the serum from the vaccinee could inhibit the wild type virus much better than it could inhibit the UK variant. So, and this is the average. So we see that the amount of antibody needed is about 3-fold higher for this variant virus to be neutralized. A second variant has appeared in South Africa. This was first reported in the 3rd week of December. This is again seems to have a different clinical features. It affects predominantly young person without any comorbidities. 2 mutation, one the same as the UK, but another one that seems to be important is at position 484. This strain has also traveled to several countries in Africa with local transmission shown here in black and to other parts of the world. Yesterday, one case has also been reported from the US, which is not shown here as colored. Again, this has increased rapidly from October by January in Africa and is making appearance in other continents where we think it will increase again. Now, this is a study again in preprint format that appeared earlier this week. They took plasma from people who were affected during the first phase between June to August 2020 and used it to neutralize virus isolated from people affected at that time and people affected in South Africa now. They added this plasma in different concentrations. With increasing concentrations, one would expect that on culture you would see inhibition with increasing plasma concentrations. That is with the first wave virus. If you increase the virus concentration, you can see the growth is very little. These are 2 strains from the variant strains from 2 patients, and we can see even with the same concentration that inhibited the first wave virus, this virus is not inhibited. This is done with one person's plasma, and that is shown here. If you see, for some of the infected person's plasma, there is no inhibition whatsoever of the South African isolate. A third isolate in Brazil, isolated from Manaus in October-November 2020. It has some of the same mutations that are seen in South Africa, but has some more mutations. And the biggest challenge here is in Manaus, there was a huge outbreak, somewhat like what we saw in India, between April to June. In October, it was estimated that seroprevalence rate was already 76%, much higher than what we have in India. And now there is a second peak, which is much larger than the first peak, despite this 76% seroprevalence, and 40% of these cases are caused by the variant strain, raising the question whether this isolate can evade immunity. It of course has greater transmissibility. And already you've seen these results. Gagandeep has shown you that the Novavax and the Janssen vaccine have clearly shown that efficacy is lower with variants than with the wild type virus. So to summarize, where are we with the vaccine rollout in India? We are doing this primarily to reduce morbidity and mortality. We are following prioritization principles based on what the world is following. We have been able to do it very soon after the rest of the world did it. And I think that's something very positive, something that has not happened in our country. Generally, we have been several years behind the West. However, there appears to be vaccine hesitancy, which I believe is partly because of complacence brought on by the fact that the disease is decreasing and we think there is a high seroprevalence. However, emergence of SARS coronavirus 2 variants, which have enhanced transmissibility, more often severe disease, and partial immune escape, I think we need to be cautious. We need to continue non-pharmacological interventions so that we can keep the disease in check and allow our economy to work. We, at least our healthcare workers, we need to take to vaccination so that we at least have partial protection that even these vaccines offer even against the variants. And we should be open at the global level, at the industry level, to the idea that the vaccines will have to be changed to incorporate the changes that have occurred in the variants, and possibly the future vaccines will be multivalent, containing not only proteins from the original strain, but also those from these variants. Thank you.